Hello and welcome to the programme here on Revelation Television. My name's Jane and I'm absolutely delighted to have a really wonderful guest today who I know you are going to be so blessed. I'm joined by Vicky, who's co-presenting. Hi Vicky.
Hello Jane.
And a very warm welcome to you, Fiona Castle.
Thank you, it's lovely to be with you.
Well, it's just so lovely to have you here. Now, of course, Roy Castle was your husband, admired and loved by thousands and thousands and thousands. Sadly died in 1994.
That's right, yes.
Of lung cancer.
Yes.
And that was really one of the first sort of cases of bringing us to the awareness of passive smoking.
Yes, in those days people were not aware that passive smoking was dangerous at all, and they'd started to become aware of it in America. And the particular kind of lung cancer that Roy had is only found in smokers, apparently. So the specialist said, "You must have smoked." And when he said no, he'd never smoked a cigarette in his life, then they had to start believing that it could be through passive smoking. And of course now, a few years on, it's very obvious that it's a danger.
And obviously you then became quite passionate about sort of campaigning and getting involved and everything else. And
it's funny because it's not something I would have chosen to do, but I got asked to do it, and I kept on being involved with it. And of course I used to hate going into public places where there was smoke. I was a dancer and singer, and in those days they used to have little ashtrays at the back of every seat, and you could see the smoke swirling through the spotlights in the theatre. It's crazy.
But I suppose with Roy, he was a musician, wasn't he? So he was in the pubs and the clubs doing the rounds, and so it was even worse.
Yes, taking lots of deep breaths.
Yes. So how did you feel when the government announced a smoking ban on smoking in public places?
It was wonderful. It was a really good day of celebration, and 75% of the nation don't smoke anyway. Right. And so therefore, I've made a few enemies. 25% of the country don't like me.
Sure.
It was quite funny because after the smoking ban in Scotland, which came before the English one, a friend of mine was on a train 2 days later and heard people moaning about the fact that they could no longer smoke on a train or in a pub. They had to stand outside in the rain. And one of them said to the others, "Of course I blame that Fiona Castle." I wouldn't say the word, but yes.
Did you have a lot of support when you were doing that campaign?
I think
and especially
so,
from other
yes.
celebrities as well.
Yes, I think people, and now I think people realise the benefit of being able to go into a restaurant and not get covered in smoke and have to put your clothes outside for a day and a half to get rid of the smell of smoke.
That's right.
No, absolutely. So, going back, Roy, what were your first impressions of Roy when you met him?
The first time I saw him was at the Palladium pantomime when he'd just made a name for himself after he'd done a Royal Variety performance. It wasn't televised in those days, but I saw him in pantomime shortly afterwards, and I just thought he was absolutely brilliant, so talented and so on. And sometime later, I knew Eric Morecambe very well and his wife, and because I'd done some shows with them, and I was spending the weekend at their home, and Roy happened to come on the television, and I just said, "Oh, I think this guy's so talented, Eric, if ever you do a show with him, will you introduce me?" And he did eventually.
He did.
So it was all his fault.
Love at first sight?
Well, it was for
Wonderful.
me. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we started to go out pretty soon after we met.
So were you both Christians when you met?
Well, Roy was brought up in the Methodist church, and he was in the choir in his little village. I was brought up, I was born at the beginning of the war, and I think most of us went to church in those days, believed in God, and did all the things. There was a prayer and a Bible reading and a hymn every morning at assembly at school and those sort of things. And I went to an Anglo-Catholic boarding school from the age of 9, where there was a very strong emphasis on religion. So it was very important in my life all the way through, but it was more of a ritual.
Yes.
than a reality, and it took a long time for me to realise that. I was 35 when I actually would say I became a Christian in the real sense.
Yeah.
Right.
And Roy then said that he saw the change in me and ran. He said I'd run past him at 100 miles an hour and he had to run to catch up.
Fabulous.
We were laughing actually because I said that I had read a quote, and I'll read this out. Roy had said to you, "I don't know why you bother going to church. By the time you get the children organised, you're in such a bad temper that it can't possibly do you any good." And you and I said, yes, we can relate to Roy's statement, because, you know, Sunday mornings sometimes are the most stressful day of the week, trying to get to church.
Trying to get the children organised is hard when it's their day off, as it were.
Yes.
And yes, I used to be very short-tempered, I'm afraid. But isn't it funny, if you can relate to it, and I was, at that time, a churchgoer, not a Christian, you know, we've all done it, haven't we? And go to the church having been absolutely evil to the children.
Yes.
Good morning, everybody.
Yes.
What a lovely day.
Holier than that.
Yes.
So when you became a committed Christian, things like that, did they change?
Absolutely, in the most amazing way, because I began to see life from God's point of view, and I wasn't so stressed out. I think one of the things that led me to the place that I came to before I became a Christian was that I was a perfectionist. And the trouble with being a perfectionist is you probably
fail.
realise you're a failure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's being a ballet dancer as well, Fiona? Because a lot of ballet dancers, you know, because of the...
It's perfection, isn't it?
It is perfection.
You're
Your body
striving
has
for
to be...
perfection.
Yes.
I think that, and I think my mother had very high standards in her home.
Right.
She wasn't a nag, she was lovely.
Yes.
But I thought, I've got to match up. And you look at other mums around you at the school gate, and they all seem to do everything that you're trying to do without any problems. And I was really struggling, and I always felt that everybody was better at everything than I was.
Do you know what I think? We can't control much in our lives, but that's an area in our life we can control, can't we? How tidy our home is, you know, how immaculate our children are, and it's the little bit of control we have. But I suppose it can get out of hand, can't it? And
Definitely, yes.
become a bit of a god.
Yes. You just said something really interesting, and there'll be people, I'm sure, who will have said, oh, that's a very strange thing to say. You said, I was a churchgoer before I was a Christian. And there will be people saying, but isn't that the same thing? If you go to church every week, are you a Christian? Just...
Yes, well, it is an interesting thing, because if you'd asked me during any time of my life, I would have said, yes, I'm a Christian. And I was, and I believed in God, and I believed in the story of Jesus. And I used to go to church, but it didn't have any effect on me on Monday morning. I went back to being the person that I was, and that was a person of abject failure. And I just it wore me down to such an extent that it was having an effect on the children and on our marriage and so on. And one day, I went up to my bedroom after I'd taken the children to school, and I just got down on my knees. And I said, God, if you're there, you've got to help me, and you've got to help me now, because I've had it. I can't go on like this any longer. And I don't think I expected an answer, but the answer came before I'd even got up off my knees.
Really?
Because a woman phoned me, and it was somebody I knew slightly. I would never have expected her to phone me. But she just said, Fiona, I don't know why I'm phoning you, but I've had you on my mind recently.
Wow.
And I had this sudden urge to ring you. She said, I feel as if you need to talk. Would you like to come over and have a coffee with me and we can talk?
Okay.
Well, I had to recognise that as God's way of
Absolutely.
answering my desperate cry for help.
Yes.
Went round to her house, poured out my problems. She was a very good listener, and then she challenged me at the end and said, you think you're a Christian because you go to church, but have you ever invited Jesus to come in and take over your life? To which I just said, no, I hadn't. I didn't realise you were supposed to. I thought I'd done everything I was supposed to. You know how you sort of have to have really good standards and do, you know, help old ladies across the road,
Yes.
do all the sort of charitable things. And it was all doings rather than being, I suppose.
Right.
And she told me that she'd suffered from depression for many years, and that when she'd taken that step in her own life, it totally turned it around. So I thought, well, if it's worked for her, it could work for me. I've got nothing to lose, and I could have something to gain.
Wow.
So I with her help, she prayed me into the kingdom
Amazing.
that morning. And Roy, when I went home, I didn't tell him what had happened, because I thought if I'd said, "It's all right, darling, I've become a Christian, everything will be fine," he'd have thought, "Oh, she's got religious mania now on top of everything else." He probably would have done a runner. But anyway, I just kept very, very quiet, because God showed me I had to live out what I'd discovered.
Yeah.
But he said much later that it was like somebody painting our house in 2 seconds flat, that I'd gone out and it was all black and gloomy, and I'd come back in and it was all light and bright and sunny.
Wow.
How
And
powerful.
yes, but he said he didn't ask because he thought it might just be a 5-minute wonder.
That's quite amazing.
I was going to
isn't
say
it?
you were good friends with Eric Morecambe, and it was Eric that got you two together in the first place. And you were saying how he felt responsible for bringing you together in the ups and the downs of your marriage. What was Eric like as a person?
He was lovely. He was always so funny. I mean, there are obviously sides of him that I didn't know any more than he knew about me, sort of in a marriage. But I just loved him. I loved him for his openness and honesty, because it didn't matter if he was talking to the Queen or dustman, he'd just say what he felt.
Yes.
And I just loved that about him. He was so funny.
Yes.
And he was lovely to be with and great fun.
Wow. Obviously, Fiona, you're married to a celebrity. He's in the public eye. Everyone knows him. When you read newspapers now and you see what the wives have to put up with of, paparazzi, was it like that then? Was there media interest in your lives?
No, absolutely
Okay.
not. Roy never saw himself as a celebrity. He saw himself as somebody who had a talent, who was privileged to do the work he really loved to do for a living.
Right.
And that was it. That was the bottom line.
Yes.
He never saw the celebrity thing. We never mixed with other show business people in order to be seen in the right places at the right time. And I think we were very boring to the press, so they left us alone.
How about when Roy died? Because I do remember vividly your family were on the news all the time at that time. And I remember Roy when he was on the train right at the very end. The media appeared to be all over your lives. How did you find that? How did you cope with all of that then?
Well, it was very different then, because we'd been Christians for quite some time. And it was interesting, actually, because when Roy came home to tell me he'd got cancer, and that it was the fastest growing kind of lung cancer, and he only had 3 months to live, I went into shock.
Yes.
So all I could do was to start to pray, and I was saying, "God, what are you doing here? What's happening?" And almost an audible voice came back to me saying, "Stand back and see what I'm going to do through this."
Wow.
And suddenly I realised that God hadn't abandoned us. He still loved us. And all he was asking of us was that we would allow him to work through the circumstances we found ourselves in at that time.
Yes.
And I shared that one with Roy. And so whatever happened, we saw it as an opportunity. If other people were going through similar circumstances, if we could help by the publicity, then that's why we do it. And we saw it like that right the way through. It wasn't because we were self-seeking. We weren't seeking publicity for our benefit in any way. Because in reality, it was quite intrusive.
Sure.
But we just felt, well, if somebody else can be helped, I gave my life to God.
Yeah.
If how he uses it is through trouble, suffering, difficulties, then I've got to allow him to do
Yes.
that. And that's how I saw it, and we both did.
Must have been the hardest thing for Roy to have to tell you that news as well.
And the children.
Very difficult. And I think, Vicky and I was sharing with you, back in the green room, that we also lost... Vicky, you lost your mother when you were 19. I lost my father. It's very, very difficult to lose someone incredibly close to you. But to then have to go through that process publicly, I can't imagine whether that would be even more difficult, or whether it's any comfort knowing that you've got all of the support of so many thousands of people.
The interesting thing is that you're trying to imagine it. The reality is very often very different.
Yes.
I remember learning that lesson